when a market deviates from equilibrium, the outcome is inefficient. So if that was confusing to you last time, don't worry, because we're basically going to do it again, just in the context of the government forces the market out of equilibrium. Okay. But I also have to talk about the data assignment today. So do you guys want to talk about the data assignment first and then do the lecture? Or do you want to do the lecture first and then talk about the data assignment? And when I talk about the data assignment, I don't think the lecture is going to take long. I think maybe it'll take an hour, maybe. And so we can spend the last hour talking about the data assignment, and I can also answer questions about the problem sets if there are any. Lecture first. Okay, that's perfect. I would rather do that anyways. Okay. So let's get the lecture out of the way then. I will do my best to not go crazy long on it. Because there's a lot of stuff that I could probably dwell on with this. Okay, so what did we do last time? Last time we talked about, I started with talking about supply, or I should say finishing talking about supply, being the upward sloping shape and what shifts it. Okay, rotten. So resource prices, other goods, technology, taxes and subsidies, expectations, and number of sellers. Okay. Then we put supply and demand onto the same graph, and we talked about equilibrium being the point where they intersect and being a point where we may not always be there, but we're always going to be moving there. Okay. And then once we get there, we stay there until one of supply or demand shifts. Okay. And they can both shift at the same time as well, which we talked about both of those cases. And really, that is the point of our supply and demand model, is to be able to use it to say, okay, when there's a shift in supply or demand, okay, when one of those tribe or rotten things changes, what happens to the price and quantity, but really the equilibrium price and quantity. Although we know that when there's a new equilibrium, we're going to start moving to that point. Okay. All of that, again, is mostly review. Then what we did was we talked about consumer and producer surplus. Okay. So when we have a market that looks like this, quantity, price, actually, let me draw this a little bit more like that. Supply, demand. Okay. We have a market that looks like this. I'll call this PE and I'll call this QE. Okay. Then we know, I'll try and stick with the same colors I did last time, that this piece right here is the consumer surplus. And the consumer surplus is defined as the difference between the willingness to pay and what the consumer actually pays for all units that they purchase. Or in other words, it's the area between the demand curve, which reflects the willingness to pay, and the price. Okay, so if the market is in equilibrium, then this is the consumer surplus. Producer surplus, being the net benefits accruing to producers, is the difference between what producers received for the good and what they were willing to receive for it, okay, which is reflected in the supply curve. So really, it's the difference between the price and the supply curve up to the number of units sold. Okay, so this is going to be the producer surplus right here, this area. Okay, and last time we did some exercises with actually calculating these areas out, but as we know, they're just triangles. Okay, now what we did at the end last time was to say, okay, the reason that we have these definitions of consumer and producer surplus is so that we can say when a market is or isn't efficient. Okay, we say that a market is efficient when total surplus, being the sum of these two things. How do I want to do this? Let me go like this. Total surplus, being the sum of these two things, is maximized. And what we showed was that if the price is above equilibrium, right, then total surplus shrinks, meaning the market's not efficient. If the price is below equilibrium, total surplus shrinks, and therefore the market is not efficient. So in our extension today, what I want to talk about is certain government policies. I think there was even a question last time about government policies. Okay. inefficiency of government intervention. And I want to talk about why these government policies are, as we define it, inefficient. Okay. Now, of course, this lecture. Okay, you can see in the title here, inefficiency of government intervention. What that is going to mean, spoiler alert, if you don't like spoilers, cover your ears, is that when the government plays around in a market, it makes it inefficient. Okay, that's what I'm going to show you in a minute. Now, that's going to sound a lot like me bashing on the government, but obviously there are reasons that these things get put into place, right? Sometimes it's politics, right? Sometimes there are economic justifications for these policies, even if they are inefficient, which I'll talk about, okay? And then later in the semester, I'm going to kind of turn all of this on its head and show you that sometimes markets can naturally be inefficient and it requires the government involvement to make them efficient. Okay, so just keep in mind that this is going to sound a lot like anytime the government plays around in a market, it's bad. It's going to read like that, but as we learn more about this, we'll see that that's really not the case. It's only a result of how we define efficiency here. Okay, so inefficiency of government intervention. So last time, to kind of motivate this, last time I showed you that when markets deviate from equilibrium, inefficiency occurs. Okay, why? Because there's a deadweight loss. You lose some surplus. Okay, now here's the key point. Okay, if you look back at last lecture and I show you, look, when the price deviates from equilibrium, you get a deadweight loss. In a free market, okay, being a market where there's no government, is that deadweight loss that results from deviating from equilibrium, is that anything to lose sleep over? Anybody? So last time I showed you, no, it's not. It's not at all. And the reason that it's not is because in a free market, we know that the market is always going to move towards efficiency. Steve had something. So like the current gas prices because of war. In reference to what exactly, Steve? Oh, I see what you mean. Like the government gets involved in the war. So that is an example of government intervention, but not in the sense that I'm going to be talking about here. You'll see why I mean that in a second. Okay. The interventions I'm talking about here are when the government explicitly fixes the price of the good, right? What the government is doing in the Middle East right now is really engaging in war, which is shifting a supply curve. It's not explicitly fixing the price. It's kind of like an indirect effect of the war. But in any case, yeah, that's a good point. You'll see what I mean in a second. Okay, so back to what I was saying. So last time I said, when a market deviates from equilibrium, you get inefficiency. In a free market, should we lose sleep over that fact? That's the question. And Jalen says no. And the reason he says no is because in a free market, we know that if the market deviates from equilibrium, it's always going to move toward equilibrium. And as it moves toward equilibrium, it's going to erase that inefficiency. Okay, so in a free market, the price will always adjust to equilibrium to achieve efficiency. Okay, so in a free market, if you're deviating from equilibrium, nothing to worry about because over time, the price is going to adjust, you're going to get back to equilibrium, and it'll be inefficient. Now, the problem comes in if a government intervenes in a market and it results in a situation where the market cannot achieve equilibrium. Okay, but if a government intervenes, meaning plays around in the market, okay, this might prevent the price from adjusting to equilibrium. Adjusting to equilibrium, which kind of perpetuates the inefficiency. Perpetuating the inefficiency. Does everybody see what my argument here is, right? When you deviate from equilibrium, you get inefficiency. In a free market, that's going to erase itself over time. If the government intervenes, it might prevent that adjustment from happening, which will keep the inefficiency going. That's what I'm saying here. Okay, that's what these words are saying. All right. Now, that then begs a very important question, which is, if a government intervention in a market perpetuates the inefficiency of that market, then why would a government ever intervene in a market? To prevent a crash, to stabilize. So remember, here we're in micro world. Okay, stabilization. You know what? Now that I think about it, to stabilize, that could be a reasonable suggestion here. To prevent a crash. Crash as in what? I see. So you're thinking of crash as in there's a rapid, say, growth in demand because of speculation, and once the party's over, demand is going to fall, and with it, the prices are going to fall. Okay. So both of those answers are reasonable, but they're kind of too specific for what I'm looking for here. Okay. The idea is, why would a government intervene? Well, apparently, the government is willing to allow the market to be inefficient in order to get something in return. And what they're getting in return is an outcome that is fairer for participants. I know that seems like a little bit of an anticlimactic answer, but you'll see what I mean in a second, okay? So why would a government intervene? To achieve an outcome that is more socially desirable, or what we say, equitable, even if it is inefficient. Okay, so basically, when a government intervenes in a market, okay, they know that's causing the market to be inefficient. The thing is, efficiency, as we define it, may not matter that much. What might matter more is how fair or equitable the market is. Okay, so the government might be willing to say, look, screw it. We'll create a market that's inefficient, but it will be fairer. Okay, that's effectively what they're trying to do here. Okay. Now, I know I've been I think the reason, I mean, by the way, your guys' answers have been good and thoughtful to these questions. But I think the reason that sometimes your line of reasoning is different than mine is because I haven't really defined exactly what I mean by a government intervention at this point. I think that was especially clear with like Steve's point about like a war, where that's clearly the government getting involved in something, but that's not necessarily the kind of government intervention I'm talking about. Here, the kind of government intervention I'm talking about is very simple, which is called price controls. The kind of government intervention I'm talking about are price controls. Yeah, ceilings and floors. So you probably talked about these in macro. Price controls. I'm almost certain you talked about them in macro. Okay. Price controls are laws. Well, this is the most obvious definition of all time. Laws that control the prices of goods and services. This is the kind of government intervention that we are going to talk about right here. Okay. This is a situation where the government puts into place a law that fixes the price of a good or service. So as an example, rent control. Not a big thing here, but in California, where rent is very, very high, you see laws put into place where, say, rent cannot exceed $2,000 a month. Can you see what I mean now when I say that kind of government intervention will prevent a market from going to equilibrium? Because if the equilibrium price is 3,000, saying that the price can be at most 2,000 prevents that adjustment from happening. Okay, so this is the kind of price control that I'm talking about, or intervention, I should say, that I'm talking about. So price controls, this prevents the price from adjusting to equilibrium, resulting in inefficiency. So I think that with a better understanding of what I mean by government intervention here, really I'm talking about a specific kind of very simple government intervention where they try to control the price of a good or service. Okay? All right. Does this motivation make sense to everybody? Any questions on this motivation? Do you guys see what I mean when I say government intervention now? Yeah. Okay. Any questions? Good. Okay, let's analyze these things then. I think these are fun to analyze. But you know, will you share that sentiment? Probably not, but oh well. Okay, so price. Let's start with talking about price ceilings. So we have two kind of price controls: price ceilings and price floors. I don't even know if I spelled. Jesus, I'm all over the place. Price ceilings. Okay. So a price ceiling is defined as a situation. I'm just going to abbreviate government like that. The government imposes a maximum price for the market. They put a ceiling on the price. Okay, so the rent control thing that I just talked about, that is a price ceiling. Okay, rent could be $3,000. The government says, hold on. The maximum price for rent can only be 2,000. That's a price ceiling. You're establishing a maximum price. The price cannot exceed this value. Okay. So a price ceiling can either be what we call binding or non-binding. Okay. When we say a price ceiling is binding, okay, maybe I'm going to write that. I'll write it here. Okay. When we say that a price ceiling is binding, sometimes you'll hear the language effective. Okay. That means that the price ceiling does something to the market. I think that's kind of evident in the effective sense. Okay. So when a price ceiling is binding, that means it's going to have an effect on the market. And what you need for the price ceiling to be binding is you need the price ceiling to be set below the equilibrium price. Does that make sense? So stare at that for a second and tell me if that makes sense. So if you need to stop and think about that for a second, then good. It should take a minute to be like, hold on. Why exactly is a binding price ceiling set below equilibrium, right? When we think of ceiling, we always think above. Okay? But what a price ceiling is trying to do is trying to prevent the price from going above, which means you need to set it below the equilibrium price. Okay. We're going to see in just a second, Caleb. Okay. I'm not going to spoil the surprise. That question's going to be answered in one moment. Okay. Okay. So let's draw this. Let's draw what this looks like. Okay, I want to make sure. Is there anybody that does not understand this? If you don't understand this, nothing's going to make sense. So if you need to stop me and say, explain that a different way, or this isn't clear to me before I move on, because this is an extremely crucial point. A binding price ceiling has to be set below the equilibrium price. Is there anybody that's not clear on that? Do not hesitate to tell me. But if you guys have seen this before, I don't want to waste time on it. If I'm just saying it again, but is there anybody that needs me to say this a different way? Good? I'm going to assume it's good then. Okay. So a binding price ceiling has to be set down here. Okay. So we can call this price ceiling. Okay. And I'll abbreviate this with PC, like so. Okay. So there's the price ceiling. Now, immediately you can see that at this new lower price, the quantity demanded rises to here, quantity supplied falls to here. So to answer Caleb's question, what has happened in this market now? There's a shortage. Good, good. Okay, good. Creates a shortage of output. Okay, you can see that at this new lower price, there is a shortage. Okay, and that is because you can see the quantity demanded rises while the quantity supplied falls. Okay, so at the new lower price, consumers really want it, but firms don't want to sell it anymore. Okay, and as a result, there's going to be excess demand, shortage. Okay, now at this new lower price, this many units are getting put onto shelves. Okay, so that's all of the units that are going to get sold or purchased. So the number of units sold, thus it's going to decrease the units sold to QS, right? Which we abbreviate with QC. Okay, so I'll say QS and I'll write equals QC. QC being the quantity that's sold under the price ceiling. Does that make sense? Okay, basically at that new lower price, QS reflects how many units are going to get put onto shelves. Okay, that's all that's going to get sold, right? Even though people want more, it doesn't matter. They're not going to get it. Okay, that's part of the reason that this is going to be inefficient. Okay, now with this, now we can see what we're going to do here. What we're going to do here is we're going to analyze the consumer and producer surplus. Okay, so consumer surplus is always the area between the demand curve and the price up to the number of units that are purchased. There's the consumer surplus. So you can see that consumer surplus in this situation has actually gotten bigger, right? It's kind of hard to see here, but this area here of this rectangle looks to be bigger than this triangle that they lost. Okay, more on that in a second. But I'll say for now that consumer surplus, okay, usually, I have to add this disclaimer because technically, as you'll see, it doesn't have to be the case, but usually it increases. Now, with consumer surplus, there's two forces, two mechanisms here that are driving the change in consumer surplus. So let's look back at consumer surplus in the original market. Okay, they got this whole big triangle when the market's in equilibrium. So in equilibrium, consumers would have got this whole big triangle, which means consumers are effectively losing this piece and gaining this piece. You see? They're losing this and gaining this. Now, the reason that they lose this piece is because they are purchasing fewer units. If you are going to get surplus from a unit, you have to purchase the unit. Okay, so the fact that there are fewer units purchased means they lose some surplus. Okay, so the first mechanism that drives the effect here is that there are fewer units purchased. And as there are fewer units purchased, consumer surplus is going to fall. Okay. However, for the units that they do purchase from here to here, there's a lower price. And with that, they gain an area of surplus. Okay. So there is a lower price. Okay, which causes consumer surplus to rise. So on one hand, there's something pulling consumer surplus down, and on the other hand, something that pulls it up. Now notice that this part of consumer surplus that increases right here previously belonged to producers. Can you see that? This was previously producer surplus. Now this belongs to consumers. So we call this area a transfer, as a transfer from producer surplus. Okay. So what this means is that because there's a force pulling consumer surplus down and a force pulling consumer surplus up, technically speaking, we cannot determine the effect on consumer surplus. Thus, cannot technically determine the effect on consumer surplus. But it's usually the case that it rises. Okay, usually it's going to rise. That's why I say up there, usually it rises, but it usually rises. Now, whether or not it definitively rises, we would always say that consumer surplus rises for those that are able to produce the good, right? The price ceiling lowers the price, and as a result, it decreases the number of units that firms want to sell. So fewer consumers are going to get the good, right? That pulls consumer surplus down. But for the consumers that can get the good, they pay a lower price. So regardless of the net effect, we would always say that consumer surplus increases for those who are able to buy the good. Who are able to buy the good. I think there's a question here. Okay, awesome. Why isn't CS the area above PE and below demand? Because PE, that's an amazing question, Emily. PE is no longer the price that consumers pay. If the price were PE, let's say that, okay, let's do an example. Let's say that PE is 5. Okay, so a McChicken is $5. Okay, I don't know why I always use the McChicken example. A McChicken's $5. The government says that's outrageous. Okay, we are making a new law, and this law says McChickens cannot be more than $2. That's a price ceiling. Okay, this price ceiling is then $2. Now, if the law says the price cannot exceed $2, this is what the consumers pay. So the first consumer who's willing to pay this only has to pay $2. So this area is the consumer surplus. It's no longer that. I hope that is a response that says makes sense. All right, Emily, does that make sense? Let me know if it doesn't. Okay, perfect. Mackenzie says, would you make that law if you were in government? Kenzie, are you referring to the McChicken example or to price ceilings in general? Yes, $2 McChickens. No, I would make it $1 McChickens. I don't give a shit. McChickens are $1. I mean, here's the thing. Like, I don't have the inside information on McDonald's, but you can't tell me that McChickens cost more than more than 50 cents to make. You couldn't tell me they cost more than 50 cents to make. There's no way in hell. They're so expensive right now because of demand. I mean, fast food used to be something that was exactly that. It was fast, but it became a thing where people actually really enjoyed it, and firms realized they could charge more for it. So the $3 loss. Hold on. Okay, let me make sure I got everything here. Would you make that law if you were in government? So to answer that question, no, I would make it $1 McChicken. got to explain everything in McChickens going forward? Yes, I do. You know, I'm kind of inspired by that. In my graduate macro class, my instructor explained everything in burgers. So the economies only make like in graduate macro, you have to set up a lot of more difficult notation. So you have to simplify the setting a lot. And as a result, the economy only produces one kind of consumption good, and that was burgers. So I kind of in a force of habit to just always explain things in terms of one thing. So yeah, I'll explain everything in McChickens. So $2 McChickens. Can you scroll down? There you go, Maria. 50 cents. I think it costs 50 cents to make. I would make it $1 McChickens. I don't know, whatever. So the $3 loss, I think Jalian's referring to the difference between the $5 and $2 isn't the example. So the $3 loss isn't a problem because they will make more money in the long run. Jalen, I would say the $3 loss is most certainly a problem for the producers, as we're going to see in a second. I'll analyze the producers right now. Okay. All right, I think I'm caught up. So let me keep going. So how annoying do I want to be? Do I want to do like producer surplus like this or like this? I'm going to be annoying and I'm going to put it right here because why not? Okay. So now let's talk about producer surplus. Okay. So consumer surplus goes up usually. Now, technically, we cannot determine the effect, but it usually goes up. Producer surplus, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's going down. Okay. And we can see that very, very easily because if we put producer surplus on here, it's this area right here. Okay. There's producer surplus. Now, producers lose both of these areas. So unequivocally, they are screwed. Okay. So again, though, they're losing both of these areas, and there's separate reasons for those. On one hand, they're losing some surplus because they sell fewer units. Why? Because they don't want to. The price is lower. There are fewer units that are sold, and as a result, that pulls producer surplus down because they can only get surplus from units that they sell, right? And for the units that they do sell, they have to accept a lower price, right? And that also pulls producer surplus down. And notice that this area that they lose because of the fact that there's a lower price. Notice this one here is referring to this area right here. Okay. The fact that they don't sell these units anymore mean that they cannot get surplus from these units here. Okay. Now, the units that they do sell from here to here, they have to accept a lower price, which is why they lose this area here. Okay. So notice that this area that they lose here is what gets transferred to consumers. So the lower price causes producers to lose area and consumers to gain it. So this is a transfer to consumers. As a transfer to consumer surplus. Okay. Now, all right, so the producer surplus analysis is easy. Now, here's the kicker. The kicker is, if you look at what happens in equilibrium, you get this whole big triangle. Here, you get a trapezoid. Okay. You lose this. So there is a deadweight loss. Deadweight loss. I'll let people color that in really quick before I do it. Okay. I can come back to that later. So now there is a deadweight loss. There is a deadweight loss, as you can see up there. Okay. Now, deadweight loss is something that it sends a shiver up my spine every time I go to talk about it. And the reason is, I think it's very, very challenging to wrap your brain around what a deadweight loss really truly is. Okay. But I want you to really be able to understand what a deadweight loss is. Okay. Now, a deadweight loss always arises because the quantity deviates from the equilibrium quantity. That's why you get a deadweight loss. Here, there is a deadweight loss because we transact fewer units. Why does that create a deadweight loss? Because the units between QC and QE from here to here, notice that they were mutually beneficial to transact. for these units between here and here, consumers were willing to pay this for it, and firms were willing to sell it for this. So selling that unit for some price between there would have benefited both consumers and producers. That's what we're losing. We're losing a valuable transaction. That's the dead weight loss. The loss that's happening is transactions that would have been mutually beneficial. A dead weight loss always arises from a change in quantity. Okay? Yes, here there was a change in the price, but that only created a deadweight loss because it forced a change in quantity. Okay? That's going to be something that's going to come back over and over and over throughout the semester. When we do taxes, we're going to see there's a deadweight loss. Why? Because we're losing transactions. When we do a monopoly, there's going to be a deadweight loss. Why? Because we're losing transactions. Okay, deadweight losses are always because of a change in quantity. Okay, in this case, we underprovide the good, and that's a problem because those units of the good would have been mutually beneficial. Okay, so there is a deadweight loss, and this arises from the fact that there are fewer units transacted, which would have been mutually beneficial had they actually been exchanged. Okay. In other words, if we look at the analysis I just did, okay, look at what happens to consumer surplus. Fewer units purchased pulls consumer surplus down. The lower price brings it up as a transfer for producer surplus. For producer surplus, fewer units sold pulls producer surplus down, and the lower price also pulls producer surplus down as a transfer to consumers. So look at what happens with the lower price. The lower price is just taking surplus from producers to consumers. There's no loss there. It's just a transfer. It's the fewer units thing that causes a loss. Fewer units causes a loss for both consumers and producers that you don't get back. It's gone. Nobody gets it. Deadweight loss is, honest to God, one of the hardest things to wrap your brain around in micro. Okay. Frankly, you're not going to need to know the exact nitty-gritty of what a deadweight loss is, but as something that's for the margin of perfection, it's important to understand. Okay. So we're going to come back to that idea. Don't worry. Now, notice that price ceilings are obviously favored by consumers, right? I mean, with the McChicken example, I think that was very clear, right? $5 McChickens, hell no. Okay, there's a law that makes McChickens $2. Clearly, that's benefiting consumers. And you can see that that's because some welfare is going to get transferred from producers to consumers. Welfare meaning surplus. They're kind of synonymous, okay? Some of that well-being is going to go from producers to consumers. So consumers want that. Okay. Now, again, not all consumers are happy because of the lower price of McChickens. Some McDonald's are going to close down. Okay. And fewer consumers are going to get them. But for the consumers whose McDonald's stay open, they're going to be happy, right? So price ceilings, they are for consumers. Okay. So note that price ceilings are favored by consumers. And that is because there is a transfer of surplus from producer surplus to consumer surplus. So if they put a price ceiling on McChickens, does it make the rest of McDonald's food increase in price? Potentially, but the thing is that, again, that would have to be justified in demand. Okay. I mean, the price of food at McDonald's is an interaction of supply and demand. If there's a price ceiling on McChickens, is that going to make people demand more of McDoubles? Not necessarily, in which case an increase in price in McDoubles wouldn't be justified. If they were to increase the price of McDoubles, then fewer consumers would buy it, and that would be another trade off for McDonald's. So it's something that I could see McDonald's trying to do, but probably to little effect because, again, those prices have to be agreed upon by consumers and producers. It's a really good question. Now, certainly that's something that's kind of beyond the scope of, yeah, that's a good question. But it's something, Mackenzie, that I can hope you see is beyond the scope of our analysis right here, right? Our analysis right here is focused on the implications of the exchange of that one good, right? The spillovers are harder to think about. But yeah, that's definitely something that could be considered. Now, speaking of those unintended things, when you look at the graph, you can get a sense of what's going to happen to this market. But there are some things that you can predict might happen here that are kind of beyond the graph. Now, Mackenzie brought up one good point, which is maybe McDonald's tries to recuperate by raising the price on other goods. Possibly. That would have to be justified by demand for those other goods. But something that could certainly be expected here, okay, as an unintended consequence. Unintended consequence. Because producers are kind of getting screwed with these laws, right? If you put in, all right, this is going to be very easy to wrap your brains around because you could totally see McDonald's doing this. But suppose that you put in a price ceiling that said $2 McChickens, McDonald's would just make the McChicken super shitty. They would just be shit. They would make the ingredients terrible. They would skimp on the mayo, which McDonald's mayo is the absolute best. They would skimp on the mayo. The chicken would be, terrible quality, awful, disgusting chicken. The bread, they would no longer steam the bread. It would just be some dry, terrible bread. It'd probably be like they'd freeze the entire thing and they wouldn't assemble it on site, whatever. Yeah, hell yeah, they would. Couldn't they also put a limit on how many you buy? Maybe they could. Yeah, I'm not sure how much that would be. I could see them doing that, Steve. I could totally see them doing that. Yeah. I think that we see let me write this down. As producer surplus falls, this may lead to lower quality goods. Now, when I see limits on purchases, I see that as something that is happening in a market where there's a shortage and there's no government intervention and the price is eventually going to adjust. Okay. Now, sometimes, though, those things are also marketing campaigns. Okay. But I could totally see them trying to do that. Right? When you see shortages in essentials at like Kroger or something, they say limit on number you can buy. There are more than just economic reasons for doing that. On one hand, it could be a marketing ploy, right? Like, oh, limit on number of Pokemon cards you can buy. A little bit of a marketing ploy. Limit on number of toilet paper you can buy. That's trying to prevent mass uprising, right? If you went to Kroger during COVID and you saw somebody leaving the parking lot with 100 things of toilet paper, then you might try to assault them. Okay. So, I don't know. Just my 2 cents. I think that works better at places like Despo's where you have a limit on how much you can buy at once. Yeah. Could McDonald's fight the price ceiling? Oh, absolutely they could. Absolutely they could. Yeah. Um, I mean, governments, I'll talk about this more, but governments are not, they are pliable in the sense that, politicians are in it to get reelected. And what do you need to get reelected? You need money. So if McDonald's came along and said, hey, look, we'll pay for your next campaign so long as you repeal the price ceiling. Yeah, absolutely. I could totally see that. Right. Now, in that case, if they're able to do so, let me put it this way. Suppose McDonald's has the political clout to go to a politician and be like, I want you to remove this price ceiling, or else I will not get you reelected. Then, as a result of that, I wouldn't see why McDonald's wouldn't go further to say, actually, I want you to make it to where I'm able to charge more, to where I have to put a minimum price on these things. Is it lobbying illegal now? No, lobbying is absolutely not illegal. At least like that, no, lobbying isn't illegal. Nope. Nope. Yeah, lobbying is definitely not illegal. There's an enormous, I mean, there's a ton of people whose careers are in lobbying, so they aren't like set forever. Are they set until someone changes it? It kind of depends. Sometimes like rent control in California, they might adjust it over time to account for inflation. There might be political challenges to it. It kind of depends. Bushman took them out to the Middle East, so I can see that for sure. I'm not going to comment on that one. Okay, let me just say the last thing about price ceilings, then we'll take a break before I do price floors. Okay, last thing I have to say about price ceilings is that all of this was the analysis of a price ceiling that is binding, okay, or effective. You also have what are called non-binding price ceilings. So a non-binding or ineffective price ceiling is one that does nothing to the market. And this is a price ceiling that is set above the equilibrium price. Okay, this price ceiling has no impact. Price ceiling has no impact. Thus, there is no deadweight loss. Okay. Easy to see this. Why? Suppose that the McChickens are $5, just as an example. I know that's outrageous. One day they will be. But suppose that McChickens are $5 and the government comes along and says, we are implementing a new law. The maximum price for McChickens is $20. You see how that's not going to do anything? They're already below that. So it's not going to have any effect on the market. That's why an effective price ceiling has to be set below the equilibrium price, right? And so if you came along with a price ceiling that said, okay, the minimum price for McChickens is, or I should, sorry, the maximum price for McChickens is $20, right? That's going to do nothing to the market. And so it's not going to skew the quantity away from equilibrium. There's going to be no deadweight loss. Okay. All right. I went a little bit longer than I wanted on price ceilings, but with price floors, it's going to be much of the same thing. So let's take a 5-minute handwriting break right now, and I can take questions, discussion in the meantime, but I won't say anything until 6:55. Okay, or 6:54. So I'll start again at 6:54. All right. So Mackenzie, that's a really, really good question. So I'm actually so we have 5 minutes. So Mackenzie says, can you give an example of a non-binding price ceiling? Why would they do it? Well, apparently it has no effect. It has no impact. So Emily, by the way, attendance, I don't take it anymore. So I only take it on the first 2 days so I can verify you with WCC. After that, attendance is not graded or mandatory. So don't worry about if you have to come in late or anything like that. Okay. So Mackenzie says, can you give an example of non-binding? Why would they do it? Okay. So that's an amazing question. So let's think of it like this. Now, there's a reason that I write non-binding price ceilings. Let's suppose that McChickens are $5. Okay, $5. All right. In fact, let me draw a graph of this. All right, here we go. I love this question. And I always think, oh, this is going to be a satisfying answer. Let's see. Supply, demand. Okay. Suppose that McChickens are $5, like so. Now, government comes in, government says, we are fed up with these $5 McChickens. It's complete and utter baloney. And we are implementing a law right now. And that law says McChickens cannot by any means exceed $3. We put a price ceiling on McChickens at $3. Is this price ceiling binding or non-binding? Yeah, binding. Yeah, it's binding. It's going to do something to the market. Okay. So now here's the twist. Suppose, okay, that a new report comes out in the mail. A new report comes out and you're on TikTok and you see it. Okay, and it says, study finds that McChickens reduce life expectancy by 20 years. What's going to happen to the demand for McChickens? It go down, right? Right, Steve? I think that was you that said that. Oh, okay. Yeah. So demand for McChickens gonna go down, right? So now, what happens if the demand for McChickens goes down so much that it goes down to there? Is the price ceiling binding or non-binding now? It's non-binding. See? So now the market equilibrium prices for McChickens is $2. That's all people are going to pay for it because it reduces life expectancy by so much, right? Being that the maximum price they can charge is $3, $2 is perfectly fine. So when you set a price control and it's binding, supply or demand can shift in such a way that makes the price ceiling non-binding, at which point it has no effect on the market. Is that a satisfying answer, Kenzie? Yeah, they're never going to set it as non-binding. Because then what's the point? I mean, somebody one time said to me, well, maybe they can set it as non-binding if they're trying to prevent the price from rising. So for example, that would be more with like price floors. Like suppose that you set a price floor to try and prevent the price from, well, even like a maximum price. Like suppose that we set a price ceiling on McChickens at $5 right now. Maybe you could argue that they're trying to prevent inflation from causing the price of it to go above that. I mean, let's be very clear about one thing. Politicians are not proactive in that sense. So I would never see a situation where you would set a non-binding price ceiling. What is going to happen is you're going to set a price ceiling and it's going to become non-binding by some market factor. So non-binding. So they never set it. I'm going to answer that question as yes, Mackenzie. So they never set it as non-binding. It can just shift to it. My answer to that question is yes. So do non-binding price ceilings typically, non-binding price ceilings are something that typically only happen because of a market factor that results in that becoming non-binding. Okay. How's that? I hope that answer is satisfying. Now, I'm going to tell you, so inflation messing everything up again. Yeah, right. Messing everything up, especially the McChicken price. Now, I'm going to tell you one very interesting thing is that I'm answering that question so they never set it as non-binding. It can just shift to it as yes. But there are some price controls that the government sets and they are non-binding. Can anyone think of an example of one? Minimum wage. Great. So minimum wage is not a price ceiling, it's a price floor, which I'm going to talk about right now. A minimum price. Price ceiling is a maximum price. The price cannot exceed this. Okay? Price floor is a minimum price. The price cannot go below this, right? So the government sets the minimum wage at, what is it? What is the minimum wage in Michigan right now? It shows how. So it's $12, right? Minimum wage is $12. Now, is the minimum wage binding for doctors? No, no, it's not. Because if you say, okay, the minimum wage is you go to a hospital and say, okay, look, the minimum wage for your doctors is $12. They're gonna say, well, okay, we're already paying them $100 an hour. You see? So some price ceilings are non-binding in certain situations, but the point of price controls, I should say. But the point of a price control like the minimum wage is to have an effect on the specific, market, in this case, low skilled labor. Right? So low skilled labor might have an equilibrium wage of say $10. So if you go to them and say, look, the minimum wage that you can charge is $12, now it's binding. See? These are really good questions. I hope that it's making sense, my answers. I almost feel like my answers aren't doing justice to these questions. Okay, so let's talk about price floors. We'll talk about price floors and then we will do some logistical stuff. Okay. So price floor, so this is going to look eerily similar to everything I've just done. So we might be able to go through this a little bit faster. A price floor is when the government imposes a minimum price. In the market. Okay. Now, as I've already kind of hinted at, a binding or effective price floor, this has to be set above the equilibrium price. So if we're thinking of the market for labor, suppose that the equilibrium wage is $15. All right, let's forget about doctors and low skill. Let's just think about just general as we can. Suppose the equilibrium wage is $15. The government comes along and says, okay, minimum wage is $12. They're not going to do anything. See, because it's, okay, we're already paying them more than that. If the price floor is going to do something, it has to be set above the equilibrium price. Okay, so now we can draw this. That line isn't straight. I don't really care. Okay, price floor has to be set right there. All right. Now, this, you can see this is all just going to be the reverse, right? This clearly creates a surplus. Creates a surplus of output. Okay. Now, in a labor market, what do we call this surplus? So if you're in a labor market, you implement a minimum wage. That creates a surplus. What do we call that? Anybody? Oh man, come on. Someone give it to me. What would we call a situation where the quantity supplied of labor exceeds the quantity demanded of labor. Unemployment. Great job, Adriana. Unemployment. We would call that unemployment. Okay. We'll talk about that at the end of the semester when we do labor markets. Okay. So this creates a surplus of output, right? Why? Because you can see that quantity supplied rises while quantity demanded falls, right? And as a result, only QD units are going to get purchased. That's it. That's all the units that are going to get. Now, this many units are going to want to be put on shelves, but only this many are going to get taken off shelves. So that's all that's getting sold. Therefore, it's going to decrease the units sold to QD, which we are going to label as equal to QF, being the quantity transacted under the price floor. Okay. Now we can do a similar exercise as we did before. This time we can identify consumer surplus right here. We can clearly see that it shrunk. Okay, so consumer surplus definitely decreases. And this is, again, because of the two mechanisms. On one hand, they buy fewer units, and so they can get fewer surplus from those units. So there's fewer units purchased, so consumer surplus falls. And on the other hand, for the units that they do buy, they're double screwed because there's a higher price. So consumers lose both this area and this area. They lose this area because they can't buy these units anymore. They lose this area because for the units that they do buy, the price has gone up. Okay. So notice that this higher price that causes them to lose this area belongs to who now? It belongs to the producers. So this is going to be as a transfer to producer surplus. So speaking of, there's producer surplus. Okay. Now, producers are going to lose this and gain this. So again, they're going to have a situation where it's technically unclear what's going to happen, but usually it's going to rise. Okay. Producer surplus, I'll say, usually rises. Again, they have two mechanisms driving that. The first is that they sell fewer units because fewer people want the good. They sell fewer units, so they get surplus from fewer units. Producer surplus falls. Okay. But for the units that they are able to sell, there's a higher price, which pulls producer surplus up. Okay. Now, that higher price that brings producer surplus up, that surplus that they get from that comes directly from consumers who now pay a higher price. So this is as a transfer from consumer surplus. Now, what that technically means is that, yes, technically we have something going down, something going up. So technically cannot determine the effect. Thus, cannot technically determine effect on producer surplus, but it's usually going to go up. But it usually rises. And certainly we would say that it rises for those who are able to sell the good. All right, forgive me for going fast, but because this is just the analogous, it's exactly analogous to price ceilings. It's just the exact same thing, except a different group that's experiencing the effect. Okay, so it's exactly a mirror, what we already did. Okay. And the kicker, there's a deadweight loss. This is inefficient. Okay. And again, the deadweight loss results from the fact that quantity falls. That's why you get the deadweight loss. Why does that result in a loss? Because quantity falls to this, and all of these units here were mutually beneficial. For all the units between QD and QE, consumers were willing to pay more than producers were willing to sell it for, right? So in other words, there's a unit of the good out there where consumers are willing to pay, say, $5 and producers are willing to sell it for $2. So why didn't it get sold? Right? That's what's getting lost. What's getting lost is valuable transactions. Okay. So there is a deadweight loss. There is a deadweight loss. And that deadweight loss arises from the fact that there are fewer units transacted. Arises from fewer units transacted, which would have been mutually beneficial. All right. So clearly the price floors are favored by producers because it's producers that receive a transfer of surplus because they get to receive a higher price. Okay, so these are favored by producers. Favored by producers. And that is because transfer of surplus okay. Unintended consequence, just like we had with lower quality goods for price ceilings. Unintended, that doesn't look like it's spelled right. Unintended consequence, okay, is that because there is a surplus, right? At that super high price, a lot of people want to sell the good and nobody wants to buy it, right? This is where black markets are likely to form. Okay. With labor, we often see, like people working under the table, right? I mean, that's for all intents and purposes, but kind of by definition, that is an example of a black market because it is an unregulated transaction. Okay. So when you get surpluses, then firms are always look for ways to get rid of that stuff. Okay. Now that leaves us with talking about a non-binding price floor. And again, very easy. A non-binding or ineffective price floor is going to be set below the equilibrium price. It just doesn't make sense to do this because, again, then it's not going to have any effect. Just like I talked about with the wage example. You set a minimum wage below the equilibrium wage, it does nothing. Just like setting the minimum wage at $12 does nothing to the market for doctors. Okay. And this price floor has no impact. And again, to Mackenzie's point, just like with a price ceiling, you can set an effective price floor and it can become ineffective, right? If you set the minimum wage at $5 an hour, that will be ineffective, right? Because the equilibrium wage is well above that, right? So setting the Michigan minimum wage at $12, right, in 3 or 4 years, that's going to be ineffective, right? Because the equilibrium wage will have risen above that. Okay. So again, it's the exact same thing, except opposite. If demand goes up, right, then it can cause the price to go above the price floor, making it ineffective. Or if supply goes down, again, you get the exact same thing. Right. That's actually an amazing point. So how federal minimum wage as a price floor means nothing in Michigan. Right. Well, federal minimum wage is still 7. Federal minimum wage is jokingly low. Just because governments don't really feel the need to mess with that because pretty much how many states don't have a state minimum wage? That I mean, I guess that's the question. Does anybody know? I don't know. Yeah, federal minimum wage is 7.25. See, that's jokingly low. Why isn't it higher? Well, because most states have their own minimum wage that's way higher than that embarrassment of a federal minimum wage. How many? I 5 states. On the South. Yeah, interesting. I mean, in those states, yeah, then that's the price floor. Now, whether or not the Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Tennessee. Yeah, I mean, in those states, you might have a situation where, I mean, even in, I'll be honest with you. I know nothing. I mean, my uncle lives in South Carolina. Maybe I should ask him, but like, it would, maybe I'm just like an out of touch person, but it would like blow my mind if I were to learn that like McDonald's workers in one of those states made 7.25. I would not believe that. Like to me, their equilibrium wage would have to have exceeded that. I see no way 7.25 is binding. A few states have minimum wages set below the federal minimum wage. So I wonder again. I'm no political scientist or anything. I don't know how these work exactly, but I wonder if that just completely. I wonder if the state minimum wage completely negates the federal minimum wage. I mean, it must, right? Here it does in Michigan. Like Michigan's minimum wage renders the um, federal minimum wage useless. North Carolina was 15. That's pretty good. It's funny because like I remember when, even I think it was around COVID time, oh, and people started proposing $15 minimum wages. And that was like heresy at that time. Like that was blasphemy to even think that the minimum wage should be that high. Now, I mean, $15 is like that's what you could expect at even here at McDonald's or something. There's a McDonald's by me hiring for $18 an hour. Most states have their own, but they are set at 7.25. Yeah, interesting. But okay, I mean, this is a great discussion about minimum wage. But does this analysis make sense? Good. Any questions on any of this? Indeed, it does. All right. Awesome.